Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me. Welcome to this third parallel session today in the afternoon on the Fragility conference. Before we start, as we are running late, I'm just gonna go quickly through the technical details. So each presenter is gonna have 15 minutes for presentation, and it's gonna be followed by 5 minutes discussion. For discussion, please use reaction, raise your hand down there on the toolbar, or just type in a chat function, and then I can read out the questions. And the first person who is gonna present is Dr. Martin Gabriel. He's a distinguished scholar and a lecturer from the University of Klagenfurt. Dr. Gabriel holds a Doctor of Philosophy degree from also esteemed University of Klagenfurt, where he serves as a lecturer with a primary focus on modern history. He will now present us with a fragile indigenous body presentation, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Could you just, yeah, okay.
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. And I guess you can see my slides, at least I hope so. Greetings not from Austria, but this time from Armenia. I hope nonetheless everything will work out fine. I will talk, since I'm a historian, I will talk about the historical topic. One of my research focuses is on the history of epidemics in colonial Latin America. And so my talk is titled The Fragile Indigenous Body, Epidemics and Ethnicity in 18th Century New Spain. So the area I will be talking about is marked here in green, but I will focus mostly on what is now southern Mexico and what is now Guatemala. I will come back to the geographical details a little bit later. There are a lot of discourses on the character of indigenous populations in the Americas throughout the Spanish colonial period. And there's a very important discourse that focuses on the continent, its nature, its environment, its animals, its plants, but also its people. And animals as well as people are often perceived as fragile, weak, or even deformed. So this discourse goes on to treat Amerindian peoples, depending on the context, this is very important, depending on the context, either as docile and childlike subjects, or as brutal and primitive. I'm using the words from contemporary discourses here, of course, as brutal and primitive barbarians. But it always depends on the context. So the same population that can be seen as fragile during one year can be depicted as potentially brutal murderers in the next year. So we always have this kind of fragility that refers to the indigenous populations, but there's also a fragility of colonial rule. Very often this is a topic that is not really talked about, but it looms very large. So we're ruling, as Spaniards, of course, we're ruling over fragile but potentially barbarous populations. And we're always talking about Spain as a very strong global empire. But there's always this sense that things could change, because in the end, this colonial rule is something that is itself fragile. And one of the large fears that Spaniards have is an anti-European alliance, especially between Amerindian peoples and African people. So this is something that comes up very often. This anteater found its way into this presentation because it became a symbol of a deformed, fragile, weak America. So it was characterized as a deformed bear, but this discourse is not about the anteater, of course. It's about America producing deformed, weak, monstrous life forms. Yeah, and so the discourse doesn't stay with the anteater alone. It also refers or can refer to indigenous populations. I have to talk for 1 or 2 minutes about the early colonial era, where we can see during the 16th century very large indigenous population losses that are often characterized by Spaniards as part of a godly plan, God who is clearing the lands of this pagan people, as the Spaniards see it. And lots of indigenous people die from certain diseases like smallpox, especially, while Europeans don't. For especially in regards to smallpox, most Europeans in America have already an immunity against smallpox. But indigenous people dying of this disease, it's not only a sign of individual weakness, but the sign of the population's weakness, the sign of society's weakness. And what is quite obvious, that Europeans don't see this illness as being directly caused by themselves, but by a supreme power. For example, God, who destined Europeans to go to America as part of a Christian plan, and these people carried the disease to America. Indigenous people are very often, as I already said, depicted as weak. Things regarding Africans are a little bit different. Africans are usually characterized as being stronger and more resilient against diseases, which makes sense as we know now, because they were more familiar with Eurasian diseases, so-called Old World diseases. Smallpox became one of the large killers during the colonial enterprise. Of course, it was not only the disease alone, but it was a complex combination of forced labor, forced migration, warfare, etc. And then you also have these diseases. Very famous is this depiction from the Codex Florentinus from the late 16th century, and also from around the same time, the Codex Telleriano Remensis, which specifically states here for the year 1538, or 7 rabbits in the Aztec Mexica counting, that many people died of viruelas or viruelas. So viruela would be the Spanish word for smallpox. And what is obvious in these depictions, there are many others, but these are very famous ones. It's about indigenous people dying. So smallpox is primarily an indigenous disease, which, as I already mentioned, makes sense in regards to earlier European immunity. Just a few sentences about medical practice. We have this very different Amerindian medical practices that rely on cosmology, religion, and the social context of disease. Of course, Europeans very often frame this as irrational and pre-modern, but we have to see that concepts of body and disease are just very, very different. Also, I would state that Europeans, while often presenting themselves as very rational, they are in some ways also very irrational, because also in the European perspective, it's hard to differentiate between what we would call medicine and what we would call religion. And who is performing medical practices in the Americas is very often people with a religious background. Europeans focus in their wording very often on clinical features, but indigenous medical experts, for example, do not really describe a clinical feature, but they refer to a social meaning. There are these very famous Kokolitsli epidemics that we really don't know that much about. We don't know what it was, but for indigenous people, this wasn't the topic. The topic was that they needed a word for this catastrophe, and they called it Kokolitsli. Yeah, so it's not a clinical feature. It's a word stating that there is a medically introduced catastrophe to a society. So these are very different frameworks. And the body, of course, in both European and indigenous context, the body is basically the battlefield. Let me frame it this way. It's the battlefield. where the battle between health and sickness happens. But we have to see the body within this complex framework of spirituality, whatever that is, nature, individual and cultural identity. The so-called modernist approaches that we see in the 18th century as part of the Enlightenment, they are put forward by Spanish administrators and medical professionals. So very important are the proto-medicos, which are the regionally responsible, highest-ranking medical administrators. And Enlightenment is often proposed as this rational alternative to something irrational. Of course, I have very big problems with this wording, but this is how the contemporary discourse works.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We can't, like, your slides are not changing. I'm not sure if you are supposed to stay on the first. Yeah, now we can see it. Thank you.
Yeah, I will just keep it this way.
Yeah, thank you.
If it's fine with you. We have this paternalist and humanist perspectives combined with economic necessities. So it's not about keeping the human being alive. It's about keeping an abstract, for example, taxpayer alive. So this is not in the Foucaultian sense anatomopolitics, but biopolitics. So it's about keeping society working. So people have to pay taxes so that the Spanish Empire can flourish. And we have these arguments of this childlike Amerindians being incapable of helping themselves. And of course, the colonial state uses this approach to basically state we have to be there for the Amerindian populations, otherwise they will perish. They are still perishing, but in lesser numbers. And we will basically, our European colonial system will allow them to exist in the future. So the colonial system, even though it is killing off indigenous populations, is presented as a way to keep alive indigenous populations because they are children and they cannot care for themselves. In regards to the smallpox epidemics, there are a number of publications from the 18th century. The so-called metodo claro, sencillo y fácil, so the clear and easy method of carrying out this inoculation, which is the precursor to vaccination. And I translated this publication from the 1790s, so a small part of it. It was written, and I quote, "It was written for those places whose inhabitants, deprived of help in such dire need, can conduct themselves for their own and common benefit through it, moderating as much as possible the ravages of such a devastating illness." So basically, it's about people being left alone. We do not know who left them alone. Maybe it was the Spanish crown, but I doubt it because it is written by Spanish administrators. But they're in help, in this dire need, and someone has to care for them. And this is a topic that we can find again and again during this 18th century epidemics, people in need of help, and the colonial state has to care for them. So these are the areas that I'm referring to. Guatemala, which also encompassed parts of Chiapas and Oaxaca in southern Mexico. I will just say a few words about both smallpox outbreaks. In Guatemala in 1780, we have this inoculation strategy only for Mayan people, so not for Europeans, Africans, or mixed populations. Only the Maya are inoculated. Again, because they are seen as fragile, vulnerable, and childlike, but also, as some administrators say, they are potential barbarians and killers, of course, at the same time. So again, this ambivalent approach. And we have a Central American economy based on human labor. So this is the main revenue source. There is no gold, there is little silver. People have to work in some other industries, and this is the central revenue source for Spain. So you have to keep them alive. The question is, and it's a question I cannot really answer, how can the characterization of Amerindians as fragile be integrated with the fact that through physical labor, they are the most important source of state income? So they are at the same time vulnerable and fragile, but the ones doing hard labor. So this is, again, this ambivalence that we can see in the colonial state. This is a publication from the late 1760s in Guatemala. And I quote, many Indians died because of a lack of cure and because of their diet that must be adjusted to protect them from various diseases. And this guide is written to address the misery of these poor ones and their backwardness. Christian charity obliges us to care for these poor, unhappy ones when they don't understand. So again, we have this vulnerable, fragile, backward Amerindian person or society, and it's only Europeans that are able to help them. But these are not simply medical discourses. It's about the precarious situation of Spanish rule. In the mid-1780s, as you can see here, we have about 2 dozens of salaried officials in all of Guatemala, which is a vast area, of course. And it's a way to force Mayan communities into the colonial framework, because now doctors are being sent, accompanied by soldiers, accompanied by administrators, by priests, and Mayan communities have to pay, at least partially, from their own monetary funds. And again, on the other hand, we have this potential barbarian topic. If inoculated children die, Spanish administrators fear they will be killed by these Mayan barbarians, as they call them. And my last 2 slides are about the smallpox outbreak 16, 17 years later in Oaxaca in southern Mexico, which is an economically very important province. Here we don't have this inoculation program. We have quarantine, which is a very traditional approach. And the focus of everything that comes after this quarantine is implemented is on children. And we have lots of court documents where, for example, mothers and fathers of these indigenous children call them pieces of their mother's hearts, pieces of their mother's entrails. So they are basically framed as being part of another indigenous person. And it's all about the fragility of the children's body. So they are fragile, vice versa, the epidemic as an enemy, but they're also fragile because the colonial state that puts them in provisional hospitals, for example, takes them away from their families, especially from the mother. So they're separating basically one body from another, but in the indigenous approach, the children and their mothers should be seen as one body. And now they are forcibly separated. Very interesting phenomenon is that combined with the protests by church officials and European merchants, the indigenous populations can change the policies, and the quarantine is ended, and then inoculation campaign is started, just like in Guatemala 17 years earlier. And there are no protests against this, and basically the indigenous population accepts this inoculation because it ends quarantine, so socio-economically it's better for them, and it also makes it possible for children to return to their families as soon as they're inoculated. Yeah, the last slide, again, this body metaphor. Ramirez has written extensively about Oaxaca, and he says that heart and innards were at the center of a rich conjuncture of meanings. And for example, when people talked about these pieces of their mother's entrails, so the children as pieces of their mother's entrails, it has this religious significance related to the sacred womb of Mary, for example, and Jesus Christ. And he says that language physically tying child to mother might have had a special purpose in a place where children were highly vulnerable, again this word vulnerable, to gastrointestinal and respiratory ailments. And I think this argument in regards to the human body and the body of Mary is very important for Mexico, because Mary, especially the Virgin of Guadalupe, is the central patron saint for what is now Mexico. It's a fertility goddess, and of course it's a mother goddess that is closely related to a woman's body, but also the children's body. So I think it's no coincidence that we can see this this close relationship between indigenous populations in times of epidemics and the worship of Mary, and on the other hand, this talk about children's bodies closely related to the body of their mothers. Yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gabriel, for your presentation.
And sorry about the technical hiccup.
No worries, no worries. If there are any questions, you can use the, as I said, reaction, raise your hand or write in the group chat. I'll just say one comment. I really liked at your beginning of your presentation how you managed to explain us the context and discourse and how the fragility is depending on the time in which it was happening and how it can actually reverse over the time. So that was yeah, quite a thing to notice. If there are no questions, we will continue because we are, as I said, running late from the first one. Thank you so much for your presentation. The next one that I'm going to introduce is Samantha Stevens, a PhD candidate at Charlton University School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies and Institute of Political Economy. Her academic journey is characterized by a deep commitment to decolonization and a profound understanding of the responsibilities incumbent upon settlers as a guest on indigenous lands. She will present us with a settler fragility and resistance and unpacking the dynamics of colonial legacies and Anishinaabe self-determination in Canada. I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. I Googled it, how to pronounce this, and there were like 9 different ways how to do it. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, and there's just as many spellings, so I used the spelling I was taught. So good morning and good afternoon. My name is Samantha Stevens, and I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Canadian Studies at Carleton University. Hopefully you can hear me well. Today I'm excited to share with you an aspect from my doctoral research in which I examine settler colonial discourses and settler transformations in the context of treaty relations with Anishinaabe in the Great Lakes region of Ontario. So today's presentation not only reflects the accumulation of my MA thesis and doctoral research, but also embodies a deep personal and professional commitment to understanding and addressing the nuanced dynamics of settler colonialism in our country. The focus of my research is particularly on settler responses, a topic that, while often uncomfortable, is crucial for progressing towards meaningful reconciliation and change. In my work, I explore how settler identities have been constructed in opposition to and often in denial of the rights and self-determination of Indigenous peoples. So as we explore the dynamics of settler colonialism and Indigenous self-determination, it's essential to begin by understanding the historical and contemporary landscapes that shape these interactions. Settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of Indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that over time develops a distinct identity and its own sovereignty. This process is deeply embedded in the fabric of Canada, and its legacies are visible in the ongoing struggles for land, recognition, and rights by Indigenous peoples. My research specifically focuses on the settler side of this equation, particularly the concept of settler fragility. Now, this term refers to the emotional cognitive dissonance experienced by settlers when faced with the realities of the colonial histories and current Indigenous demands for justice and sovereignty. Such fragility often manifests as defensive stances, which include denying, ignoring, or rationalizing the historical and ongoing impacts of colonization. So to dissect these complex interactions, I utilize Norman Fairclough's 3-stage critical discourse analysis, or CDA, a method that allows me to examine language and discourse as a form of social practice. The CDA is particularly useful in revealing how power relations, identities, and ideologies are enacted and reproduced through language. It provides the tools to analyze not just what is said, but how it is said, and the underlying power structures that inform these dialogues. So applying CDA helps us understand how settler narratives and discourses about Indigenous peoples and issues are constructed and how they function to maintain or challenge the settler colonial status quo. So by looking at various forms of public discourse, including media articles, government communications and debates, and legal texts to see how they reflect and shape the perceptions and interactions between settlers and Indigenous communities, we can create a more holistic understanding of how settler colonial discourses work to legitimize power and maintain status quo in Canada. So understanding settler fragility is essential as it provides insights into the emotional and psychological barriers that inhibit meaningful dialogue and progress in settler and Indigenous peoples' relations. Settler fragility can be defined as the discomfort, defensiveness, and resistance displayed by settlers when confronted with the realities of Indigenous rights and histories of dispossession. This term, which echoes concepts like white fragility in racial discourse, help us grasp the emotional responses that arise when deeply held beliefs and narratives are challenged. As Dina Gilio Whitaker writes, like white fragility, settler fragility is the inability to talk about unearned privilege. In this case, the privilege of living on lands that were taken in the name of democracy through profound violence and injustice. Like white privilege, white supremacy is also at the root of settler fragility. The difference is that foreign invasion, dispossession of Indigenous lands, and genocide were based on white European religious and cultural supremacy as encoded in the doctrine of discovery, not racial supremacy. Settler fragility often leads to a range of reactions, from denial of colonial impacts to outright hostility against Indigenous claims and movements. Such reactions are not mere personal feelings, but are indicative of a broader societal attitudes that can significantly affect public opinion and policy. This fragility is rooted in the historical amnesia or deliberate distortion of colonial histories. Many settlers, whether consciously or unconsciously, partake in narratives that justify or ignore the colonial past. When these narratives are challenged by the resurgence and reassertion of Indigenous rights and voices, it creates a cognitive dissonance. So in applying critical discourse analysis to examine how this fragility is expressed in various forms, I looked at a sample of political speeches and debates, legal texts and relevant cases, and media portrayals and news coverage from the last 168 years in Canada to see how settler fragility both shapes and is shaped by the discourse surrounding Indigenous issues. So CDA is based on the premise that language is a form of social practice and is deeply entwined with power. This approach allows us to explore how discourse serves to reinforce or challenge social inequities. Now, Fairclough's three-stage model of CDA proposes that discourse analysis should operate on three dimensions. So text analysis, where we examine the language, style, and structure of texts, discursive practice, which involves the production and consumption of texts, and sociocultural practice, where we consider the broader social and cultural effects of discursive events. This tripartite framework is essential for a holistic understanding of how settler fragility is manifested and perpetuated through discourse. By analyzing text at these three levels, we can uncover the subtle ways in which language contributes to maintaining status quo, or conversely, how it can be a tool for change. So in the context of my research on settler fragility, text analysis lets us scrutinize the specific linguistic features and choices that characterize discussions about Indigenous rights and settler history. Discursive practice examines how these discussions are framed within various media and educational systems, looking at who gets to speak and who is silenced. And sociocultural practice explores the broader impact of these discourses on societal beliefs and actions, including policy decisions and public perceptions. So examples of settler fragility can be seen within two significant case studies from my research, examining how settler communities react defensively when confronted with challenges to their historical and ongoing impacts of Indigenous rights. Through these two case studies, we can see how settler fragility manifests, but also how it is gradually being addressed. So the first case study is mercury contamination in grassy narrows, which is the top picture, which is a sign warning people not to drink the water. In the 1960s, industrial activities led by settler-run companies resulted in severe mercury contamination in the waterways near grassy narrows, an Anishinaabe community. The health impacts have been devastating, including neurological disorders linked to mercury poisoning. The settler media and government initially downplayed the crisis, exhibiting settler fragility through narratives that either denied the severity of the contamination or framed the response in a way that sidelined community advocacy and leadership. This reflects a discomfort in acknowledging the settler responsibility for the environmental degradation and health crises inflicted on the Anishinaabe in grassy narrows. Yet persistent advocacy by Grassy Narrows, supported by environmental groups and health experts, has shifted the narrative. Recent years have seen a reluctant but growing acknowledgement in settler discourse of the community's autonomy and rights, highlighted by legal victories that compel government action and funding for healthcare. However, these efforts were sidelined during the COVID-19 pandemic and yet have to be restarted. Case study number 2, the Robinson-Huron Treaty and Anishinaabe Agency, which is the bottom picture, a sign that marks the barrier of the Robinson-Huron Treaty territory. So the Robinson-Huron Treaty was signed in 1850 between the Crown and Anishinaabe, has been the basis of ongoing disputes as Anishinaabe communities assert their sovereignty and treaty rights, particularly the annuities owed to the community. Of note, these payments were only increased once in 1874 to $4 per person. Settler institutions have shown fragility by initially resisting the acknowledgement of treaty implications, preferring to maintain a narrative that minimizes Anishinaabe sovereignty and Crown responsibility to pay and increase annuity from natural resources extracted from the lands. This fragility is evident in the paternalistic policy approaches and the slow pace of legal recognition of Anishinaabe laws, sovereignty, and right to annuity payments. Through continued legal challenges and shifting public opinion, there is an emerging recognition of Anishinaabe governance and laws, particularly in the political, legal, and news media spheres, marking a shift towards dismantling the colonial attitudes embedded in settler responses. For example, the settler judge who decided that Crown has the legal obligation to increase annuity payments and give back pay for the failures to increase the payments has been met with scorn and criticism. Her abilities and aptitude to perform law have been questioned by the provincial legal team, who appealed her decision that supported Anishinaabe sovereignty. The critical discourse analysis revealed several key shifts in how settlers discuss and react to Anishinaabe agency of broader Indigenous claims. For instance, from ignorance to recognition, initially much of the settler discourse either ignored or trivialized Indigenous histories and rights. Over time, there was a gradual shift towards acknowledging these aspects, influenced heavily by increased Indigenous activism and public education efforts. However, this recognition is often superficial and limited to symbolic gestures rather than leading to substantial change or policy or practice. Number 2, defensive responses to direct confrontation. When faced with direct actions or demands from Indigenous communities, such as land claims or calls for treaty enforcement, settler discourse often becomes defensive. This defensiveness is the manifestation of settler fragility, where settlers perceive these claims as personal or collective attacks on their identity or legitimacy. 3, rhetorical shifts in political discourse. Politicians and public leaders have started to adopt more inclusive and acknowledging language when discussing Indigenous issues. Terms like reconciliation, partnership, and respect have become more common. However, the analysis suggests that these terms are not always backed by action or genuine understanding, indicating rhetorical shift rather than a substantive one. 4, media framing and public perception. The role of media in shaping public discourse cannot be overstated, especially in the coverage of a marginalized and misrepresented population. The findings indicate that although there is more coverage of Indigenous issues than in the past, the framing often emphasizes conflict or uses patronizing tones, which can undermine the agency of Indigenous peoples. These shifts are critical in understanding the current landscape of settler-Indigenous relations. They reflect a complex interplay between growing awareness and ongoing resistance, between surface-level acceptance and deep-seated prejudice. And I'll just quickly go over the implications on settler narratives. So we're seeing this reconstruction of settler identity. Settlers are having to confront their complicity in the system of settler colonialism, and this reevaluation can lead to what Eva Mackey refers to as settler uncertainty, where settlers struggle to reconcile their perceived historical identity with the reality of colonial impacts. There's also resistance and backlash. This backlash is often a response to the perceived threat against settler legitimacy and can manifest in increased support for policies that undermine Indigenous claims. There's also political and educational narratives. Political leaders increasingly adopt inclusive language regarding Indigenous issues, and this rhetorical shift, however, needs to be matched by substantive policy actions and to move beyond performative allyship. And in education, incorporating truthful representation of Indigenous histories, rights, and ongoing struggles can significantly alter settler narratives by equipping future generations with a more accurate and respectful understanding of our nation's history. And here are some of the sources that I've referenced throughout this presentation. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation. If there are any questions, please, as I already said, react or write in a chat. If not, I would just then ask one question, like regarding the discourse analysis. Like language can also be seen through, for example, I don't know, movies or some like books, because we talked about educational system. And in Croatia, at least like 10 years ago, maybe or even more, like in the school books, we didn't have, for example, word Inuit. We had Eskimo, which is like racial problem, obviously. So like, is it still a case in Canada, all these cases that we could see that in education, they're still portrayed in a different manner?
It's very diverse across Canada. It depends on region, it depends on school board, and it depends on kind of the political climate in the area. So for instance, in BC, they're very much more forward in kind of rewriting a lot of these history books and incorporating more Indigenous perspectives, particularly on the West Coast, where many of the First Nations are sovereign nations, versus say more interior into the prairies and even in the East Coast, where education is a little slower and rewriting those books is a little bit slower. So a lot of educators, teachers have taken it upon themselves to actually bring in elders and Indigenous community members to actually speak on that history rather than relying on history books itself.
Thank you for the answer. If there are no any other questions, we can move to the next presenter. And it's my great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Maitosh Mandal. He's an esteemed assistant professor of economics at the Department of Humanities, Economics, Arts, and Rural Technologies at the Indian Institute of Technology at Dharwad. Dr. Mandal's school endeavors exemplify a profound commitment to the field of Dalit studies, where his contributions have left an indelible mark. He will now present his work on conceptualizing Dalit fragility in the 21st century. And Mr. Mr. Matos, yours. Zoom is yours.
Yes. Thank you so much. Is it visible?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for this opportunity. It means a lot to me. I have been listening to a few brilliant presentations. My previous speakers also presented very well. I've learned a lot. So the title of my presentation is Conceptualizing Dalit Fragility in the 21st Century. This paper expands upon my previous research within the realm of Dalit studies, arguing that the concept of fragility, denoting vulnerability and brokenness, is crucial in understanding the plight of Dalits in India. The term Dalit, embraced by those formerly known as untouchables or outcasts to assert their identity, quite literally connotes brokenness in the sense of being broken into pieces or crushed underfoot. B.R. Ambedkar, an influential Dalit figure and prominent Indian thinker, traced the origins of untouchability to ancient broken men, individuals who were either separated from or abandoned by their nomadic tribes. These broken men, also referred to as Antaja, dwelled on the outskirts or Anta of villages, compelled to undertake menial tasks such as carcass disposal for survival. Some resorted to consuming the flesh of deceased cows and bullocks. With the rise of Buddhism, which preached acceptance irrespective of social status, many broken men embraced the religion. However, as Buddhism declined and Brahmanism resurged, they faced further marginalization, stigmatized for their dietary habits and religious beliefs. The untouchables were excluded from the normative society, which was based on the caste system. Caste system promoted strict boundaries between the castes, which prohibited exogamy or marriage outside of one's caste. Caste system was moreover built upon what Ambedkar described as graded inequality. This hierarchical system placed the priestly caste or the Brahmins at the top, and thereafter the military caste or the Kshatriyas, the mercantile castes or the Vaishyas, and the laboring caste or the Shudras. The broken men were forever the outcasts, because they were never included within the caste system. In fact, according to Ambedkar, it is their status as outcasts that kept the logical basis of caste system intact. Caste system was also characterized by what Ambedkar described as the division of laborers as opposed to division of labor. That is to say, it did not promote division of labor, but destined communities to specific forms of labor forever, thus disallowing individual inclination or desire to explore occupations other than the hereditary ones. In other words, caste was not a worth-based but a birth-based social system. One's birth determined one's choice of occupation and social status. Freedom of choice was foundationally opposed to caste system. Caste system also did not allow an individual's change of caste. On the contrary, those who did not abide by the rules of the caste system were stigmatized and thrown out of the caste system. These stigmatized individuals became a part of the larger untouchable community. Touching them or even crossing their shadows was considered polluting and impure. Would take shower in sacred water if anything of this kind ever happened. And as Ambedkar would repeatedly assert, the caste system was fundamentally opposed not only to the principles of liberty and equality, but also to the fraternity. In that it did not consider a section of the humans as humans. Now, if we turn to the discourse of fragility in the context of human rights and human dignity, there are two perspectives that I find particularly striking. The first one is proposed by Judith Butler in her conceptualization of vulnerability. One scholar has demonstrated Butler's radicality as a thinker as he contrasts her notion of vulnerability with that of Martha Feynman, the American thinker. Feynman understands vulnerability to be a universal condition applicable to all human beings. Whereas Feynman argues that all are vulnerable, Butler emphasizes that some are more vulnerable than others. For Butler, vulnerability may be a universal condition for all human beings, but what happens when some humans are not even considered as humans? Therefore, for Butler, there is a hierarchy of grief, quote unquote, a hierarchy of grief, and those who are considered subhuman are the vulnerable of all vulnerables. Any discussion of fragility with reference to the discourse of human rights must begin with the predicament of those who are yet to be recognized as humans or with the most vulnerable section of humanity. The second perspective that I find interesting and important is derived from the concept of human dignity as discussed by Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism. Once again, this is via one scholar who has connected human rights and the concept of totalitarianism from Hannah Arendt. For her, human dignity is fundamentally a political concept. It's not a metaphysical concept, it's a political concept, but is marked by conditional fragility. Conditional fragility. Human dignity is fragile because it depends on two factors. The individual, it depends on two factors. First, the individual in question must assert her dignity. So assertive part of it, and the powers that be must recognize her dignity. With reference to the horrible treatment of the Jewish population in the concentration camps, Arendt considers that human dignity was stripped of all its political meaning as the powers that be did not recognize the Jews as humans. With this discourse at the backdrop, I claim that the untouchables of India, or as they call themselves, the Dalits of present time, were or are not only the most fragile population, the vulnerable of the vulnerables, but their human dignity is stripped away even today, every day in the 21st century. This paper proposes a novel framework of tripartite categorizing of contemporary caste-based violence based on a case study from 2023, very latest set of reports, and aims to conceptualize Dalit fragility as a distinct manifestation of caste-induced marginalization, vulnerability, trauma, dehumanization, and atrocity. Whereas many caste deniers argue that caste is a thing of the past and that caste-based inequality was practiced only in the previous centuries, this paper demonstrates that Dalit fragility and vulnerability is not only a reality, but is very much on the rise, both in quantitative and qualitative terms. As of 2020, crimes against Dalits, who constitute a worldwide population of 260 million, occur every 10 minutes, indicating a troubling increase compared to previous decades. Indeed, if we look at the data of the National Crime Records Bureau of India, NCRB, we would be astonished to find a jump in caste atrocities in the last decade. In 2010, every 18 minutes a crime was committed against a Dalit. In 2015, it increased to every 15 minutes. And in 2020, it became every 10 minutes. Another data can be shared, as I have shown, whereas in 2018, 42,793 cases were registered. In 2022, 57,582 cases were registered, almost 15,000 increased. Experts believe that the recorded crimes are the tip of the iceberg, because in most cases do not register cases out of fear of revenge and violence. These crimes encompass a wide spectrum, including genocide, lynching, murder, arson, rape, economic exploitation, workplace harassment, social and religious ostracization, verbal abuse, hate campaigns, and online defamation. Moreover, caste-based discrimination persists in the Indian diaspora, notably in the UK and the USA. Now, I would move to the tripartite kind of categorization that I have come up with reference to the quality and the quantity of the atrocities that are taking place today. So, whereas many data and charts can be produced to show the increase in caste-based violence, it is through a qualitative analysis of some of the instances that one can make sense of the depth of Dalit fragility. Dalit fragility involves physical, psychological, and social damage to the Dalits. This paper broadly describes this damage as Daliticide. That's a coinage, Daliticide, or the murder and destruction of the Dalits. As part of my ongoing research, this paper concentrates on a few specific caste-based atrocities, or Daliticide, that took place in 2023. Reports of over 500 crimes have been consulted and cross-checked to classify these atrocities into three main categories. And these are my categorization: the banal Daliticide, the barbaric Daliticide, and the theatrical Daliticide. I argue that Dalit fragility can be illustrated in terms of these three forms of Daliticide. So the first one is banality of Daliticide. Banality of Daliticide refers to normalization and routinization of murder, victimization, and dehumanization of Dalits. Such crimes are not only insensitive, but also abrupt, unjustified, meaningless, and simply pointless. Some reports from 2023 from across the different states of India will establish this point. So there are different instances of banality of Daliticide. The first one is mere gestures. So you make a simple gesture as a Dalit, and the dominant castes attack you, even kill you. That's the banality of Daliticide. So a Dalit, I have given a few examples. A Dalit ward member was murdered in Tamil Nadu merely for staring at the dominant caste's men. In Tamil Nadu, once again, a Dalit man was beaten up by the dominant caste people because he accelerated his two-wheeler. An elderly Dalit man in Madhya Pradesh was beaten up because he failed to greet the dominant caste men with folded hands. A Dalit youth was attacked for sitting in front of upper caste men in Tamil Nadu. In Gujarat, a Dalit youth was beaten for wearing sunglasses. A Dalit youth assaulted for addressing a dominant caste man as brother. So he addressed a dominant caste man as brother, and he was assaulted. How dare you? And a few more examples. Access to water. In Uttar Pradesh, a Dalit student was bruised and beaten for drinking water from bucket in school. Because he's a Dalit, he cannot have access to water. In Uttar Pradesh, once again, a Dalit family was beaten by upper caste men for bathing at tube. In Uttar Pradesh, once again, a Dalit farmer was assaulted to death because he fetched water from the public tap. So ghettoization still continues. And you have examples of minor theft. In Uttar Pradesh, once again, a minor Dalit boy was killed because he allegedly stole sugarcane from the field. In Telangana, a Dalit man was beaten to death because he stole electric cables. In Bihar, a minor girl, a Dalit girl, was beaten to death with sticks because she plucked chickpea plant leaves. In Mizoram, the Dalit man was assaulted and paraded naked because of soybean theft. In Karnataka, a Dalit man was assaulted and tied to a tree because allegedly he stole coffee. So these are what I describe as the banality of Daliticide. Now, if I move to what I call the barbarity of Daliticide, barbarity refers to savage physical violence exerted on the Dalits. Here are a few reports from 2023. First is very much infamous in India, and it's called honor killing. In Bengaluru, a dominant caste father hacked his daughter to death because she eloped with a Dalit boy. A girl was strangled to death by her father because she was in love with a Dalit youth who thereafter committed suicide. So both the girl and the Dalit boy committed suicide, died. A dominant caste father killed his son for marrying a Dalit girl, and then the grandmother who came in rescue was also killed. In Jharkhand, a Dalit woman was stripped naked, brutally beaten over a love affair. a Dalit man was chopped into 7 pieces in Himachal Pradesh for having an affair with a dominant caste man, a caste woman. So these are examples of barbarity, but barbarity of Daliticide. Gender violence is also very much predominant. A Dalit woman was raped and then set on fire in Rajasthan. In UP, a Dalit woman was raped, killed, and her body was chopped into pieces by dominant castes. In Rajasthan, acid was thrown on a Dalit teen's face, a bullet was put to her chest. In Madhya Pradesh, a Dalit woman was stripped naked and her son was killed because they refused to accept the demands of the dominant castes. So these are the barbaric, I'm sorry if these are very much graphic, but these are the barbaric instances of Daliticide. Third category is what I call the theatricality of Daliticide. Theatricality refers to the spectacular display of savage violence exerted on the Dalits in front of others or a mob. Here are a few reports from 2023. In Madhya Pradesh, 2 Dalit men were thrashed and forced to eat dirt. A political leader in Rajasthan made a Dalit man lick his shoes and a cop then urinated on him. In UP, a Dalit boy was assaulted, forced to drink urine, and his eyebrows shaved. In Telangana, a Dalit man's head was tonsured and then he was bitten for 3 hours. In Maharashtra, a Dalit man was hung upside down and bitten with sticks over suspicion of theft. In Uttar Pradesh, a Dalit boy was killed and then hung on a tree by upper caste men. In Rajasthan, a Dalit man was beaten to death with bricks, his eyes smashed and body dragged naked on the street. So these are, once again, I'm very sorry because of the graphic descriptions. I have cross-checked different news reports to, basically give you what has actually happened. So I'll just end the show and I'll explain my, the conclusion. Yeah. So okay. So basically, I will conclude. There is a little bit of analysis. In a couple of minutes, I'll finish. So, what do we understand about Daliticide in the context of the discourse of fragility? So, how do these 3 categories of Daliticide that I have described help us conceptualize Dalit fragility in the 21st century? I would offer 4 observations. First, there is a qualitative difference between the sufferings of the untouchables in pre-independent India and the plight of the Dalits in contemporary times. Whereas social exclusion and ostracization were the predominant forms of discrimination in earlier times, what we witness today is physical and mental torture, along with social stigmatization. Therefore, the vulnerability of the Dalits is more evident and tangible today, and they are in a more precarious condition now than ever. Second observation, as we witness the rise in murder of the Dalits, it would perhaps be more appropriate to describe the Dalits as increasingly becoming fragile and not just vulnerable. So I'm basically distinguishing between these 2 words, vulnerable and fragile. I'm indebted to Fernando Rubio, the first speaker of this conference, who has developed a fine distinction between vulnerability and fragility. For him, vulnerability refers to the risk of being damaged, a risk that can be prevented or foreclosed through proper measures. Fragility, on the other hand, refers to the state of being already damaged. When thought in the context of the Dalits, we find there are several measures in place to prevent atrocities against them. There are legal provisions that have declared the practice of untouchability as unlawful, offered affirmative action for the Dalits, and provided measures to penalize caste-based atrocities. Many Dalits have converted to Buddhism, dropped their surnames, engaged in inter-caste marriage, launched political parties as well as inter-caste national and international solidarity movements. And even then, these measures have had only limited success because of what we have seen, the systemic Daliticide. It appears to be beyond prevention. In such a context, I feel the Dalits should be described more as fragile and not just vulnerable. Third observation, while considering the possibility that Dalits are becoming increasingly fragile, it would be pertinent to reflect on the clinical and political reasons of Dalit fragility. I would like to take recourse to 2 observations. First one, following Sigmund Freud, is that Daliticide is a casteist aggression deriving from a sense of insecurity and the need for self-preservation as experienced by the dominant castes. The second one, following Karl Marx, is that violence is the midwife of history. This implies that today, unlike a century ago, it is factually true, Dalits have earned the right to education and are to be found even if not in big numbers, in various public and government services. They are no longer confined to their hereditary menial jobs and have excelled in jobs previously made exclusive to the dominant castes. Such social mobility could be a reason, both from a Freudian and Marxist points of view, why aggression and violence against the Dalits have started to increase, because the space conventionally but illegally colonized by the dominant castes is now being decolonized through Dalit visibility. And the final observation, as Professor Rubio further states, thinking from fragility poses a different set of notions, as it places us in front of the end of things and bodies, forcing us to assume and think from their loss and to ask ourselves what kind of horizons and possibilities arise from it. In my view, when we reflect upon Dalit fragility or the continuing deaths and traumas of so many Dalits, we could perhaps think of a future, although it arises out of innumerable sacrifices, where Indian subcontinent and diaspora would become a casteless society. This is not a false hope. In the midst of increasing atrocities, the legal system of the country has offered at least some amount of justice. Let me mention very quickly, in 1 minute, I'll finish. Let me mention a few reports of justice from 2023. In Nepal, 24 persons were awarded life sentence for killing 6 Dalit youths. A Sikh man was sentenced to jail in the UK for targeting Dalits in an offensive online post. A court sentenced a youth to life imprisonment for abducting a Dalit girl. Jail terms were awarded to a man who attacked Dalits who wanted to play together. Karnataka High Court sentenced 10 upper caste persons to imprisonment for assaulting Dalits, and the list goes on. So there are justices, meted out to the victims. Just one line conclusion. I conclude by saying that based on the above discussion, the history of the Dalits in India could be divided into at least 3 interconnected phases: untouchability, vulnerability, and fragility. Whereas Dalit fragility constitutes the extreme moments in this trajectory, we can only hope that there will be light at the end of the tunnel, and that that out of this dark womb of violence, the next generation of Dalits will reclaim their human dignity and personality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mandel, for your presentation. Are there any questions? We have some 2 minutes, if there are any. If there are not questions, I have more like comment or question. I don't know actually how to form it. Basically, like, Martin, Dr. Martin is having a question.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I have a question that relates to the political environment in India right now. Is there, we all know about the, let's call it Muslim issue that the BJP is focusing on right now during election times. Is there some kind of offensive, strategically offensive politicization of the Dalit topic? So are there some groups within whatever party that are really picking up this topic, and is it or is it does it not make sense to deal with this topic in election times? So maybe you cannot win votes when you're dealing with this topic. So is this politicized in some way or not? Thank you, and thanks for your great presentation.
Thank you so much. To quickly respond, yes, it is politicized, and as you mentioned, the vote bank factor is very much connected to the Dalit issue, and different political parties would try differently to speak on behalf of the Dalits. But Dalits have their own political parties as well. In states where they have been dominant, the chief ministers from among have been elected and so on. So Dalits have a very, in some cases, Dalits have a kind of an uncompromising attitude when it comes to being appropriated by other major mainstream political parties. But yes, to just respond quickly, yes, it is very much politicized. Yeah. Thank you for listening so carefully. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I see we have another question, Victoria or Katica, I don't know.
It's Katica. Hello. Thank you very much for your very extensive presentation. My question is, I assume that since the Dalit people are through the whole of history very much under pressure and other repressions, so assume that there is a large diaspora among from Dalit people. So is there any connection? Could these diaspora societies be your ambassadors and agents to promote your situation through history and nowadays?
Thank you so much for, I mean, absolutely, the answer is yes. There is there's a long history of how and when Dalits, many of them went away from India. And for example, there is a big Dalit diaspora in the USA. And there are many activists, Dalit activists, who are currently based in the USA. They have written memoirs. There is somebody called Suraj Yangre and Tenmaji Natarajan, two big names who are fighting. And it's a very interesting question, because there are many activist groups and organizations who are working from the USA and from the UK. For example, there is a group called the Caste Watch, and the Caste Watch, they have outlets in the UK. They have outlets in the outlets in the USA, and many are trying to connect the fight of the King and Ambedkar. So you have Ambedkar King Circle in the USA, where the anti-racist and the anti-casteist fights are being done together in terms of solidarity. And also in India, there was a Dalit Panther movement, which was derived from and inspired by the Black Panther movement. So the point I'm trying to make is that there are many people in the diaspora, particularly in the USA, which has a big Dalit diaspora, and they have very strong pressure groups built up, and they constantly keep watch of what is happening, not only in India, but also in the larger Indian subcontinent and also in the diaspora itself. So there were many instances of reports of caste discrimination in the USA. And in California, new policies and laws have been also implemented. In the UK court, there were debates about implementing anti-caste laws. Also, it eventually got co-opted by the anti-race and kind of policies and laws. But this is very much, as of now, this is very much a presence, very much of a presence. And Baba Saheb Ambedkar said that wherever the Hindus go, they will take casteism with them. Long back, almost 100 years back, and that is to some extent true, I would say. Yeah, but it's a very important question. There is an entire discourse on Dalit diaspora and caste discrimination in the diaspora. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manuels. Now we have to move on as we are late with the timing. Now it's my honor to introduce Associate Professor Efrat Aviv, a distinguished scholar in the Department of General History at Bar Ilan University, with a formidable academic background and a wealth of expertise. She will make presentation about cultures of fragile community, the Turkish Jewish community, and anti-Semitism. And the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for attending. I would like to present to you today the story of a fragile community. Pardon, the story of the Turkish Jewish community and anti-Semitism. Do you hear me well? Do you hear me well?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I would like to note before I commence that my presentation today won't dive into specific anti-Israeli incidents. Instead, it will explore our recent anti-Israel rhetoric turned into an anti-Semitic aid campaign, leaving the Turkish Jewish community feeling threatened and intimidated. Again, I would not discuss today the Israeli-Palestinian issue, neither the Turkish-Israeli relations, but I would rather present you how these struggles or even the war has influenced the Turkish Jewish community in Turkey. So I would like to begin with some perceptions of anti-Semitism which prevail in Turkey. We have what Erdogan said in 2014. Back then, he was prime minister of Turkey. Later on, he's become president of Turkey. And he said in 2014 the following, and I'm quoting, "Even during the first half of the 20th century, when anti-Semitism reached its vicious peak, our country never allowed this ideology to enter our lands." In 2024, just recently, I think it was a few days ago, he said, "No matter what you do, the stain of anti-Semitism will not stick to us, to the Turks." Talip Küçükcan was AKP's parliament member between 2015 and 2018, and he said that neither Turkey nor the Islamic world is the motherland of anti-Semitism. Turkey has opened its arms toward the world Jews during the wars. And I would like to stop here and explain to you that there's a conception in Turkey that the Jews, the local Jews, are actually guests because they were welcomed or invited, depends whom scholar you follow, by the Sultan Bayezid II. After they were expelled from Spain, they were invited to settle down in the Ottoman Empire, and ever since until today, they are perceived as guests in Turkey. Anti-Semitism occurred in Europe. It is a European creation. He said that in 2015. İsmet İnönü was the president and prime minister of Turkey, and he said that throughout history, the plague of anti-Semitism did not exist within the Turkish nation. Davut Şahin, who is a scholar and also a journalist, said, "I do not believe there's anti-Semitism in Turkey." Was in 2014. Selçuk Ünal, former Turkish Foreign Ministry spokesman, between 2010 and 2015, I think it was, he said there has never been anti-Semitism in any part of our history, and there will never be. Racism does not exist in the culture and tradition of the Turkish nation. Said that in 2010. Now, maybe like other countries, the main manifestations of Turkish anti-Semitism are basically verbal publications, and I will elaborate about this in a few minutes. Social networks and actions. Of course, this characterizes many countries, but there's still something very special about anti-Semitism in Turkey, and I'll present it to you in the next few slides. Now, I would like to focus on anti-Semitism under AK party rule, because really I don't have time to scrutinize the history of anti-Semitism in Turkey, but I would like to focus on current period. Okay, let's say from the beginning of the AK party rule. So here we see that during Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009, the operation was actually a war campaign between Israel and Palestine. And of course, as Turkey is pro-Palestine, some anti-Semitic rhetoric has been spread ever since AK party took power. So here we see a picture when the chairman of the Eskişehir-based Osman Gazi Cultural Federation placed in the window of his office a sign which read, "No Jews or Armenians are allowed through this door." And like you see in the pictures, some other shopkeepers have followed him. And the sign on my left side reads, "Dogs entrance is free," unlike Jews and Armenians. And what's the connection between Jews and Armenians in Turkey? That's a very, very good question, in case you wonder, because there's no connection actually between both. And if you look at the picture again, you look at the signs, you see that they are written in Turkish. We are talking about the operation that happened between Israel and Palestine, like I said before. So if you refer or if you direct these signs against Israeli Jews, as you should, right? Because the struggle is between Israel and Palestine, then how come these signs are written in Turkish? what Israeli Jew would understand Turkish. We don't. So this also means that these signs are directed at Turkish Jews and not at Israeli Jews or even Jews outside Turkey. Here in 2010, when the Mavi Mamra, if there's any need, I would refresh your memory. There's the 8th flotilla that was sailed from Turkey to Gaza and was stopped by Israel, by IDF, the Israeli army. And in this stage is what I call the normalization of anti-Semitism, or like the previous scholar said, the banalization of anti-Semitism. I think it started at this point. But when I speak about anti-Semitism, I usually refer to anti-Semitism towards Turkish Jews. And what happened on the following the Mavi Marmara incident was that the Turkish Jews were accused of helping the IDF, helping the Israeli army, and translate and investigate the Turkish activists on the deck of the ship, and that they also fought on the deck, not only translating and investigating, but also fought on the deck of the ship for the IDF. And this was proved not true, but this is the beginning of how Turkish Jews have been perceived as not only guests, like I said before, but also betrayers. 2014, we have the Operation Protective Edge. Like you can see on my right side, some correspondence taken from Twitter or X network, and in this correspondence, they called each other, the people that converse here. They plan to set on fire factories which belong to Jews in Turkey, and then they say that they should set on fire the Jews themselves. But pay attention to what they say here. They say Yahudileri ve kiliseleri. Kilise in Turkish means church, and Jews usually.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, we can't see the slides again. Can you?
You can see the slide?
No.
Not the previous ones either?
No, we can only see the first one standing alone.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, now we can
Oh.
see it. Now we can see.
Now you can see. Oh.
Now, yeah.
That's pity. Now you can see it?
Yeah, now it's working. Thank you.
So maybe I should go back just to show you what I meant. This is the sign that there's no entrance for Armenians and Jews. And if you see now, then I'll continue. I hope it works well now. So again, this is a tweet from Twitter, and like I said before, they plan to set on fire Jews in their synagogues, but instead of synagogue, which means avra in Turkish, they say kiliseleri, their churches. Like they cannot distinct between churches and synagogues, like between Christians and Jews. Also, we have some quotes from Shamil Taya, who is a journalist and scholar in Turkey, and he said, may your race be extinct and may you never miss your Hitler. Erdogan said that those who condemn Hitler day and night have surpassed Hitler in barbarism. Now there's a very interesting dichotomy in regarding Hitler or Hitlerism in Turkey, because on one hand, some circles claim that Hitler did not finish his work and he should have murdered every Jew existed. But on the other hand, they like to, in many cases, they accuse Israeli politicians, Israeli leaders of being Hitler or acting like Hitler or acting even worse than Hitler did. So let's move forward. Okay. I hope you can see this slide, but on my left side, you can see a crossword that was published in one of the newspapers in Turkey. And the final answer was Seni arıyoruz. Seni arıyoruz means in Turkey, we are looking for you, we are waiting for you. And in the picture, you can't, but you have to believe me, there was a picture of Hitler, like, we wait for you, Hitler, we're looking for you, Hitler. That was published in 2014. In 2015, I myself took this photo in one of the quarters, touristic quarters in Istanbul, and you can see Kafgam there. That's the Mein Kampf translated into Turkish, but there are two main problems with this translation. The first one is that this book was not translated with editor's notes. Like, there are no introduction or any guidance of how to read this book, and no background on the history of Hitler or Nazi Germany, and so on. And the other problem is that this book is quite accessible. It's very available. You can find it everywhere. It is sold still today, even in supermarkets, so you can find it everywhere. And now we'll go to Iron Swords War, October 2023. Like you see on the the right side, you can see a shop, bookshop in Sahaf, one of the areas in Istanbul. And the shopkeeper hanged again a sign saying, "Jews not allowed, Yehudiler Giremes, Jews cannot enter this shop." After the media's intervened, this sign was taken off. Yes, it was removed, but still the shopkeeper told the same media that still Jews are not allowed into his shop. And pay attention, please, that in this sign, there are both languages, English and Turkish. So it directed at Turkish Jewry, but also to other Jews, unlike what we saw in 2014. Here we see a synagogue that was sprayed with the Katil Israel, with the, it means murders Israel. And again, it was not sprayed on any Israeli institutions or any Israeli representative institution like consulate or embassy. It was sprayed on synagogue. And in Turkey, in many cases, there has been tradition of what we call synagogue attacks, not only physical, but also by writing things, or even throwing eggs at synagogues. This tradition, unfortunately, is quite popular. And again, it raises the question, why synagogue? Why Turkish Jewry? Why not Israel? On the left, the right side, pardon, you can see a Byzantine church that on one of its walls, again, curse against Israel was sprayed. And we might expect graffiti to be sprayed on a synagogue, yeah, but it is difficult to understand why it is sprayed on Byzantine church or at any church at all. And I have to tell you that this incident was repetitive, because other churches and even a pastor in Turkey were damaged during October and November 2003, following the war with Gaza. Here again, we see protests of medical students. And if you think that they protested in front of the Israeli consulate in Istanbul, you're wrong again. They protested in front of the Jewish hospital, which of course welcomes and accepts everyone, and old man house, old age home, pardon, that is situated right next to this hospital. And I'm again raising the question, why institutions that may represent Turkish Jewry, why not Israeli institutions? In here, we can see a title of one of the Islamist, I would say Islamist newspapers in Turkey. And the title here, although portraying or presenting Israeli soldiers. I'm not sure if they're authentic or not, but it's not the question here. The title reads and refers to Judaism, not to Israel, not to IDF soldiers. It says that for 3,000 years, they, Jews, have been killing with their weird or odd faith. And then the next title is the world must wipe out this virus. And again, it refers to Judaism or to Jews, not to Israelis, not to Israel, not to the Jews in Israel, to Judaism. Here we can see a picture that a friend of mine in Turkey took a few months ago. It was hung on in one of the very luxury neighborhoods in Turkey. And here we see again the Turkish obsessions with Hitler. And the caption here reads, Hitler did not die. He only transformed into another shape. And if you can identify in the picture, this is the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. About to conclude, but just before that, I would like to present to you the Ismaila Jamati. Ismaila Jamati is the religious movement who has close ties with Erdogan and with the AK party, really warm relations. And their leader said the following after October 7th, and I'm quoting, "What Hamas did in Israel is something we here in Turkey also need to do. There is no requirement for a large number of people. We can manage it with our own people here." It says we should do to the Turkish Jewry what Hamas did to the Israeli Jews on October 7th, 2023. There are other examples. For example, there's Suleiman Sezen. He was an AKP municipal council member of Samsun, and when he commemorated Nazi Germany leader Adolf Hitler again, he said, "The world will have a peace and tranquility after it is cleansed of Jews." In history, everyone got angry at Hitler because he was a racist, but Hitler had a saying. A man said, "You will curse me for every Jew I did not kill." And he is right, or he was right. And again, it comes from above, from the government, for government representatives. And this is a great reason for concern. If to conclude, I skip because I don't want to extend my lecture and take other scholars' time. So I'll conclude now with your permission. Turkish society intertwines anti-Israeli sentiments with anti-Semitism, blurring the distinction. You can see in Turkish newspapers reference to the Jewish soldier, whereas it should have been the Israeli soldier. It happens very much, it's very common mistake. And this blur is also a reason for concern. Jews in Turkey are perceived as guests, we've discussed that, and betrayers, lacking integration into Turkish society. The government's role in driving current anti-Semitic sentiments is key to understanding the increase of anti-Semitism in Turkey. Like I said before, the problem in Turkey, unlike other countries, is that that anti-Semitism is dictated by the government from above. And I don't know if there's any example like that in the world. I mean, I cannot imagine any prime minister or president of any country that dictates and uses anti-Semitic rhetoric and vocabulary. There's exists a dichotomy regarding attitudes towards Hitlerism in Turkey, serving both, like I said before, to justify Hitler and his actions on one hand, and to draw comparisons with Israeli leaders on the other hand. The denial of anti-Semitism existence, like we commenced this presentation with all these perceptions and quotations that say very in a very assertive way that anti-Semitism does not exist in Turkey. So the denial of anti-Semitism existence and its trivialization are key drivers of ongoing anti-Semitism in Turkey. Consequently, the Turkish Jewish community is dwindling, particularly among the younger generation who are increasingly migrating to Europe, the USA, and Israel. Thank you very much for your attention and listening.
Thank you, Dr. Aviv, for your presentation. We have time for like a short question because we really exceeded time here. I don't know if anyone is having question. Please raise your hand or write in a chat. I guess there are no questions. Thank you once again. I would comment on it, but we are really late, so we have to move on. So the next one is actually my colleagues and my work. So I have a colleague, Victoria Kundra-Berosh, who holds a PhD in interdisciplinary humanities from University of Zadar, who is our host. And she has been employed at the Institute for Migration and Ethnic Studies since 2009 as a librarian. Her research interests are issues related to migration, identity politics, and national identity, diaspora, collective memory, and politics of emotion. My other colleague and mentor is Katica Juščević, who is currently employed at the Institute for Migration and Ethnic Studies in Zagreb. She defended her doctoral dissertation in the field of social sciences, field of sociology of migrations and social history in 2007 at University of Bremen in Germany. And her scientific interest includes the following fields, which are migration, return migrations, and Croatian diaspora. And I'm the last one, and I'm going to present our work. I'm currently pursuing my master's degree in Denmark in the program of culture, communication, and globalization, with a special focus on international politics, migration, and social movements at Aalborg University in Denmark. I'm just going to share my screen and presentation. I hope you can see it, and I hope we are not going to have problems with the presentation. So our team is vulnerable people in the Balkan route. So today, millions of people around the globe are on the move, many unprotected and at risk of abuse. And over the past decades, migration processes have been in particular focus, and in their complexity, they affect almost every country in the world. The number of international migrants has significantly increased in the second half of the century, particularly the number of people leaving their own country due to ethnic, religious, racial, or political persecution. According to UNHCR data, 108 million people were forcibly displaced at the end of 2022, with children making up 40% of all forcibly displaced persons. This figure includes refugees, asylum seekers, other persons in need of international protection, and internally displaced persons. The category other people in need of international protection was introduced for the first time in mid-2022 and refers to a particularly vulnerable group, people who are forcibly displaced outside their country across international borders. These are people who are not registered as asylum seekers or refugees, but are in similar circumstances and need international protection, protection from forced return, and access to all services in the host country. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights emphasizes the primary concept of dignity and the equality of rights to all members of human community. Implicitly, it also recognizes the concepts of vulnerability, which arises from our bodily excellence, proximity to the other, and dependence on the other, as Judith Butler points out, highlighting its social, political, and ethical dimension. Our bodily existence and dependence on the other makes us precocious, as Butler emphasizes, where the other, we might say, is at the same time both a source of insecurity, but also protection and security, placing us in a position of interdependence and opening up the social dimension of precarity. Moreover, this precarity is always specific and dependent on the economic and social infrastructural organization that then exposes the level of the political. It affects everyone, but it's not distributed equally. The political level is precisely the distribution of precarity, which is tactically but unequally distributed within society, creating a hierarchical pyramid through which positioning simultaneously gain not only a degree of security and protection, but also hierarchy values as life, which then represents an ethical dimension. We are moving on with migrants who are representing a particularly vulnerable group in the possibility or impossibility of realizing human rights, and a group of which precarity is mostly distributed, even when it does not concern forced migrants and other persons in need of international protection. With the increased burden of precarity, for example, in the labor market, migrants, women particularly bear this burden, and the second generation as children of migrants encountered increased discrimination due to their migratory background. In this context, in this paper, using the example of the refugee migration flow that was redirected through Croatia and so-called Balkan route in 2015, we will analyze the dimension of migrants' vulnerability through this possibility or impossibility of realization or violation of human rights when the states on their path feel threatened and fragile, which also indicates the fragility of human rights. Croatia has always been marked as a country of emigration throughout history, and until 2021, its migration policy was characterized by a focus on its diaspora and its return. This simultaneously indicates an ethnicization of migration policy. Only by signing the Stabilization and Association Agreement did Croatia begin to develop refugee protection policies, because it was a prerequisite for European Union accession. The first Asylum Act was adopted in 2003 and came into force in 2004. Croatia has adopted most of the measures of common European asylum system, but problems occur in implementation, especially regarding integration policies and practices. The first asylum was granted in 2006, but Croatia remains primarily a transit country for asylum seekers and refugees, because 80% of asylum seekers leave Croatia before the process is completed. In the initial reactions of the refugee flow redirected through Croatia in 2015, the emphasis was on the humanitarian aspect and the empathy of citizens and public officials. At the Croatian-Slovenian border, a series of stopping several hundred, sometimes even more than 1,000 individuals could be directly observed. At the same time, significant engagement of police forces, mobilization of municipality services, and activization of local solidarity networks were recorded. At the Bragana-Obrežje border crossing, located near official entrance to Slovenia, an improvised camp containing tents, temporary stands, mobile sanctuary facilities, additional fences, and places for disturbing food and clothing was created. Media reports on those days also highlight distressing incidents at nearby Croatian-Slovenian border, crossing Harmica-Rigonce. In one case, a man reportedly fainted from exhaustion and dehydration. At the same time, another person climbed onto the bridge fence and threatened to throw himself into Sutla River as an expression of despair over the uncertain and unstable situation he found himself in. Amidst the refugees' demands for opening the borders and their blockade at the Bragana route, the police reaction escalated. Police units, including dog squads and emergency teams, were deployed, helicopters monitored the area, and tear gas was used in attempts to control the mass. The migration crisis thus opened up numerous legal status, organizational, financial, health, domestic, political, foreigner political, and security issues that indicated the fragility of even the right to live and personal security of migrants and their position in the hierarchy of distribution and insecurity. Sorry, I skipped the slide. The closure of the borders led to an increase in human smuggling activities, highlighting management challenges and raising numerous human concerns. Consequently, the Western Balkans region became a temporary zone squeezed between Greece and Bulgaria on one side and Hungary and Croatia on the other, both of which had fully closed their borders on the other side of the European Union. Estimates in the second quarter of 2018 showed us that about 8,500 people were accommodated in the reception centers, unofficial shelters, or outside of the country across Western Balkans. The share of children in this migrant population oscillated between 19 and 32%, with the percentage of unaccompanied minors among them varying among countries from 8% in North Macedonia to high 52% in Serbia. Most of these unaccompanied minors were boys from Afghanistan and Pakistan. This period represents a critical point in the European migration crisis, illustrating the acute challenges faced by migrants, but also the response of host countries at the borders. Responses ranging from state-imposed border closures to movements of solidarity at the grassroots level, underscored the complex correlation and point of antagonism between the imposed imperative of national security and the humanitarian demands that characterize the discourse on migrations with the European Union. The response to the crisis, which was declared national, included the immediate reaction of government organizations and civil society organizations, along with the religious, humanitarian groups, and new efforts of solidarity. Initially, this humanitarian response prevailed, but the gradual closure of the Balkan route brought about an advanced radicalization and dominance of the security discourse that sees migrants as a threat. The other that endangers and which is the source and cause of threat and insecurity to the domicile population. The Croatian government thus turned towards a secularization strategy where the rights and needs of refugees as extremely fragile persons are neglected. Since the end of 2017, Croatian border policy has been under scrutiny, and numerous non-governmental organizations, internal entities, and other stakeholders have expressed concerns about the behavior of Croatian border guards. The Croatian government increasingly perceives migration as a security problem in the national context. In response to the closure of the Balkan route, Croatian authorities escalated their efforts in the border surveillance and consistently engaged in pushing migrants back to Serbia. The journey has become dangerously risky and tragically illustrated by the case of Madina Husini. In November 2017, a 6-year-old girl lost her life after being hit by a train. A horrific event that occurred after Croatian border guards allegedly directed her family to walk along the railway track leading back to Serbia, according to her family. Madina's mother reported that the border guards denied any assistance, even as she held the lifeless body of her daughter, and they insisted forced the family to return to Serbia. Doctors Without Borders documented cases of the other migrants who were forced by Croatian border onto the same dangerous railway tracks. Attempts at illegal border crossing in Croatia result in migrant casualties, highlighting the terrible consequence of lack of safe and legal paths for seeking protection in the European Union member states for individuals located in Serbia or elsewhere in Western Balkans. In December 2018, Border Violence Monitoring, an organization dedicated to monitor civil rights, released several videos allegedly show unauthorized pushbacks along the border between Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Croatian government denied these claims, arguing that the border patrols are performing their duties in legally protecting European Union borders and suggesting that migrants might be fabricating accusations of violence to support their asylum claims. Despite this, there are complaining evidence that numerous migrants who failed to secure entry into Croatia show physical injuries, damaged mobile phones, and other indicators of having been subjected to violent encounters during attempts to cross the border. This situation raises significantly concerns regarding the respect of rule of law, the role of civil society in Croatia. In 2018, the National Ombudsperson reported that the Ministry of Interior consistently denied her access to databases, recordings, and documents key to investigating allegedly rights violations by border officials. In addition, civil society groups offering assistance to migrants after their arrival encountered physical attacks, accusation of illegal activities by political figures, and legal proceedings. Specifically, a volunteer from NGO was found guilty under a statute that prohibits aiding irregular migrants after their involvement in documenting encounters between police officers and Madina Husin's family. On January 17, 2023, the European Court of Human Rights issued a key ruling. Sorry, and I just need to change slide. Yeah, the key ruling that Croatia was found guilty for violating the human rights of refugees and other migrants. This ruling offered a measure of justice for 3 individuals who lost their lives and for Abedjai Darabu, who sustained serious injuries while under the supervision of Croatian border police, highlighting Croatia's violations of fundamental human right to life. 2 weeks after this ruling, on January 31st, Center for Peace Studies, along the attorney Lidija Horvat, convened a press conference to point out the lack of reaction from Prime Minister Andrej Plenković and Minister of Interior Davor Božinović to this critical judgment. This silence is particularly alarming given the judgment reveals a severe violation of the right to life, one of the most basic human rights on a large scale. Subsequent treatment of Darabui casts additional doubt on Croatia's commitment to human rights and dignity. Despite the tragedy, his asylum request was proceeded only after the fatal incident. Furthermore, he did not receive appropriate medical or psychological care for his injuries or trauma from witnessing the death of his friends. The Ministry of Interior of Croatia denied his asylum requests, and police officers detained him and allegedly subjected him to psychological and physical abuse. Interestingly, 2 years after the incident and without any justification, Croatian authorities labeled him as a threat to national security, deported him to Morocco in 2018, and banned him from entering Croatia for 5 years. These examples reflect systematic violations of the human rights and of refugees and migrants, indicating the failure institutions forced on protecting human rights, and thereby also hierarchically positioning these institutions in order of political power. Numerous human rights organizations and non-governmental associations reported that Croatia is in its policy of return since 2019. This brief overview of human rights violations on the Balkan route in Croatia not only points out the hierarchical pyramid of realizing human rights and managing life that should be universal, but also to the hierarchy relationship of positioning the social, political, and ethical dimensions in which the dominant political dimension is prevalent. The hegemonic political dimension of the relationship toward migrants with the secularization discourse has constructed migrants as the other, regardless of the migrant populations who endanger us. It threatens us by penetrating our national body, indicating at the same time our feeling of insecurity. The dominant security discourse in the coloration, the dominant ethnicalization of interference of our bodily excellence, exegemize and the social dimension of interdependence, in which relations and feelings of insecurity or threat and security or protection oscillate between the others and us. Hage highlights how the materialization of surface and border and our national body, the other material as an object, as a foreigner body that can be managed and ultimately removed. In such a hierarchical order, the ethical dimension of a relationship towards migrants as our endangered and fragile other, whose imposition of insecurity and dependence on our protection is placed at the rear. This also points out the fragility of the concept of human rights, which primarily resist on ethical dimensions in the order of political power. And that these are the references we used in our research. I don't know if anyone is having any question. Yes, Samantha, I think you raised your hand. Or no, no. Okay, anyway, if there are no questions, we are a bit late, 10 minutes behind the schedule. And I think now it should be like 10 minutes break, and then you can join to the other two panels. Thank you for following, thank you for presentations, and thank you for participations, everyone. It was really interesting session, and I'm really glad I could be the moderator of this one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.